God bless you, my brothers and sisters. We are continuing in our 40 Days of Decrease series as we are rounding the corner toward day 40. Today is day 37. Our scripture lesson for today is John chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. And as always, I want to commend you to take the time to read through the scriptures for today as we work our way toward day 40. Today we are fasting from your voice. When suffering reaches its deepest point, silence often feels like absence. We're conditioned to respond to pain with commentary, explanation, or noise. Yet scripture testifies repeatedly that God often accomplishes his most significant work in quiet spaces, moments when human voices fall away and attention is reoriented. And Lent invites us to consider whether our constant speech has crowded out our capacity to hear. Today's fast is from our own voices, so that God's voice may come into sharper focus. Your voice in this fast represents the impulse to fill silence with words, defensive explanations, anxious commentary, constant feedback, or even well meaning prayers that leave no room for listening. Spiritually, this manifests when we react before we receive and speak before we attend. To fast from your voice is not to deny expression altogether, it's to practice restraint, to withhold speech long enough to recognize that hearing requires silence. John tells us that after the resurrection, the disciples go back to their familiar patterns. In chapter 21, verse 3, Simon Peter says to the group, I'm going fishing. And they said to him, we will go with you. They speak decisively, but without discernment. And all night they catch nothing. As morning breaks in verse 4, Jesus is standing on the shore, and the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. And he calls out to them, not with correction, but with a question. In verse 5, he says, Children, do you have any fish? And they answer simply, No. Their words finally align with reality. Jesus instructs them in verse 6, Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they obey without argument or explanation, abundance follows because recognition comes after listening. John writes in verse 7, the disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, It is the Lord. Hearing precedes recognition, and silence gives way to clarity. Throughout the scriptures, God speaks in ways that require attentiveness rather than assertion. The disciples' failure is not skill related, it's attentional. They were busy acting and speaking, but they were inattentive to presence. Jesus doesn't raise his voice, he's not competing with them for attention. He waits until hunger and silence makes hearing possible. Fasting our voices is not passive, it's an act of trust that God will speak when we're ready to hear. Here's the heart of today. When our voices dominate the conversation, God's voice becomes difficult to discern. But silence creates space for recognition. The risen Christ stands closer than we realize, watching over us even in moments where we do not discern his presence. But recognition of his presence requires attentiveness rather than assertion. And so Lent trains restraint of speech. By fasting from your voice, you practice listening as an act of faith. This discipline strengthens humility, patience, and attentiveness to God's presence. Silence is not emptiness, it's preparation. And so today's fast invites intentional stillness, periods of silence, refrain from speaking, from texting, from posting, or even explaining. Even while I'm sitting here working through this lesson, my phone is going off and it's flashing at me and it's trying to get my attention. And I had to just lay it down and take a moment to be here and present with you. And in so many cases, we're not doing that when it comes to the way we engage God. We get so busy and we're working through things and we're talking and we're making noise and we're texting and we're explaining and we're talking and we're uh, having dialogue and discussion and going about our days. But today, let the question remain unanswered for a while. Listen for what surfaces when noise subsides and attend to God without rushing to respond. These are your reflection questions for today as you prepare to pray. How do I use my voice to manage anxiety or control outcomes? What am I afraid to hear in silence? And what might obedience look like before explanation today? Again, I want you to take the time to actually read through the scriptures today. That's John chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. And then take the time to be still and to pray. Ask God to show you where your voice is crowding out his, and then wait for answers. God bless you, my brothers and sisters, and we'll see you on the next day of Lent.